Thanks, Daniel, for that lovely introduction. Just to explain, I was joking a bit about last time I was in this lecture theatre. I think I was in first year uni and spent most of the year snoozing. So I hope I don't have that effect on you guys. Thanks so much for coming. Can I just get a bit of an audience gauge? How many people are current students in the audience? It's about half. And practitioners? Another half. Awesome. Okay, great. Nice balanced audience. Give me an idea of where to dwell. So I'm going to begin with that great quote from Stephen Taylor. Thinking about the house is to think about the city, and to consider the kind of city we want is to consider the way in which we choose to configure our housing. I love this quote for two reasons. Firstly, it encapsulates how we think about every residential project, that it must be conceived of at the personal level for the family who will inhabit it, and it must make the lives of the occupants a joy. When we design a house, we're also contributing to the city, or to the making of a city, with every single individual house. Secondly, it reminds me of how differently our generation thinks about the future of the city from previous generations. For instance, in the 1960s, the future was this kind of utopic combination of space technology and outstanding structural engineering, with electromagnetic generators and controlled lightning bolts. It was full of hot chicks and silver lycra. Space travel was big news. We hadn't had an energy crisis yet. Everyone was optimistic, and technology promised to be the answer to all our woes. It would give us non-stop leisure and save all our labour. If we fast forward to the 1980s, the popular vision of the city has really shifted dramatically in its tone. It's now a dystopic future. Technology's turned on us. The city's hostile, and the city's a place where life has really lost its value. There are still hot chicks in lycra, but maybe, just maybe, they were scary robots underneath it all. So more recently, if we fast forward again, the future of the city is looking pretty bleak in the popular culture, as if no one can imagine that the city can continue. The city's on this self-destructive path. And the message seems to be that the city itself is unsustainable. So I'd like to look at, very briefly, just how the city's actually changed in that time frame. So here's a slide of Sydney in 1960. I'm sorry about the watermark. As predicted, the city went up dramatically in the middle, and it went out dramatically at the edges. The impact of technology has been enormous in terms of our daily lives and how we live and work, but it hasn't had the radical physical change that we'd anticipated, like the lightning balls. So the city of 2013 is sadly a far cry from the optimistic super tech city imagined in the 60s. But happily, it's not yet the dystopic vision of the 80s or the nigh disaster and gloom vision that we're getting in movies at the moment. And the hot chicks, well, 50% of women in Sydney are obese or overweight, and 70% of men, as an aside. So growth in our city centres is necessarily upwards, and at the city fringe, and at the city fringe we continue to sprawl. It's rather a disappointment. I feel like it's a bit of a failure of the imagination, given that we were predicting postmen who could fly through the air to deliver our mail only 50 years ago. Towers look pretty much the same, only bigger. Houses are essentially the same, only bigger and often uglier. Roads are bigger, cars are bigger. Universities and schools look the same, but with computers everywhere. There are real changes in architectural type are seen in the retail sector. So malls and mega stores and restaurants that you can drive through. And technology parks where people drive away from the centre of town to reach their place of work. And all those types of buildings I see as essentially the same. They're a dense nucleus of activity in a massive cytoplasm of parking, if you'll excuse the bad metaphor. So how we live hasn't changed enormously. A house from the 60s has bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchens and living rooms and dining rooms. New builds are bigger and they have more bathrooms, but essentially how we live is the same. There are a few minor changes. Our family types are changing. Kids are staying at home longer, so there's a desire for more bigger bedrooms to support more adult occupants. And there are also more single families. or single occupants of dwellings. People are often working from home, and that can have spatial implications on the design of a house. And what we see in our practice is that people just have a hell of a lot of stuff, which needs to be stored somewhere in a house. But we're essentially still building houses and apartments as we were 50 years ago, and not as we'd imagined. This house rotates to meet the sun. How awesome. So to return to Stephen Taylor's quote, to think pragmatically about the future of the city is to think about housing. Our populations are increasing and we need to think about how to house people and how this will grow our city. I'm going to present some of Tribe Studio's projects in an attempt to formulate a future vision. The first is a radical urban intervention, a speculative project. I'll follow that with some built work and finish with some speculative housing types if we have time. I have to apologise in advance. I'm breaking the sacred contract between presenter and audience. I haven't timed this talk. So if I run over, Daniel's going to ding me off and everyone can go and have dinner. So the radical urban intervention. In 2008, we were invited to consider a future vision of Sydney. We imagined there were no cars, so the city became a pedestrian and bike-centred city with limited delivery transportation and new public transport infrastructure. So the roads became redundant because there were no cars, and therefore we could use all the roads as new building sites. So we proposed that we would insert new buildings down all the roads in the centre of Sydney. So the city of 2008 looked like this in figure and ground. Our proposal was to add 60 linear kilometres of building into the city to create a new urban condition which looks like this in 2050. So the grain of the city becomes more like a medieval city or a Middle Eastern city. It's really tightly packed. More like this is Nolly's plan of Rome. The size and the character of the streets changes from the scale of the car, so you have broad streets at the moment, relative to built form, changes to the scale of the person, so we get a narrow system of laneways. So for instance, King Street might go from looking like this, with 3 lanes of traffic, to looking like this with a very narrow apartment building running down the centre. So this new layer of residential and mixed-use development spreads over the whole city, introducing, creating a 24-hour city full of occupants, bringing kids into the city, and with the new occupants becomes a new desire for services and so on. So the new strip buildings that stop at intersections, which we thought this proposal was a lot more detailed than I'm showing tonight, but this was kind of the most interesting outcome of it. In mapping Sydney's public spaces at the moment, you find that they're all huge and really spread apart, whereas in our scheme, you have this new, finely packed system of small piazza-scaled spaces across the city, which would really transform how we live. Underground car parking is, of course, redundant. So car parks can be used for water harvesting and waste management and as underground farms. So according to street size, you could have different sized apartments, small affordable apartments as the ones on the left, they're 5 metres wide, or the 11 metre wide luxury stacked houses in the middle. And then on the right hand side of the screen is the cross-section of a vertical school. So the city it houses 200,000 new residents and also has all this new institutional and cultural program spread out across its breadth and width, which was kind of an exciting vision for the future of the city. So now I'll zoom into the individual house. At Tribe, we're really interested in housing and the domestic. We're interested in housing as the fundamental unit of city growth, but we're also interested on a really personal level as the house as a kind of portrait, or a non-figurative portrait, or maybe as a kind of non-figurative non-portrait of sorts. It's the kind of shell in which you live out your daily lives or express yourselves, express your family. As Lucian Freud said, everything is portraiture, everything is autobiography. I love the idea that a house is at once a portrait of our clients and it's simultaneously expressive of ourselves and of our interests in architecture and engagement with the culture at a greater level. So treating the house as a portrait or a piece of work that's really about the client, we find that that allows us to experiment with architectural language and be quite free of having a fixed style. So the first house I'll talk about is actually my own house in Surrey Hills. So this is a very personal story about occupying the city and imagining an urban future for people like us. When we bought the house, it had 9 tenants. There were padlocks on the inside and on the outside of all the cupboards. So we tried not to think about why that was, who was being locked in or out. And it was actually literally a crack den. There were syringes embedded in the carpet and it was pretty gross. But the hard-edged junkies were moving out and the yuppies were moving in. We had no kids at the time and now we have 2. I have an aunt who very kindly babysits sometimes, and every time she comes over there is a 100% certainty that she will try to convince us to move somewhere with parking, where the streets are safer, where you'll have more space for the children, darling, and a proper garden to play in. And we find this hilarious. We're very much of our generation, of this demographic, who's 30-somethings who are opting not to move out of the city and into the burbs, even though we have kids. We choose 0 commute time, great restaurants, city parks, galleries, theatres. We choose not to garden. We choose not to have all the benefits that people who live in the suburbs enjoy. Nevertheless, our problem is that we have a lot of stuff, I'll return to this slide, that our suburban friends also have, but we have about 1/4 of the space in which to shove it in and no garage for the bulky bits. So how do you convert an inner city terrace into a house that will suit a growing family on a small budget? Firstly, we decided to celebrate the house's rich history. It was built in 1904 and completely butchered by a DIY madman in the 70s. It's had a rich and varied life. It was a modest worker's cottage at the turn of the century. It was an interwar slum and a student share house. Actually, some friends of mine from school lived there when they were at university, which is a bit weird. And in the 90s and early 2000s, it was just a dirty crack den. And now it's home for a professional family with 2 kids. So the strategy of celebrating the old allowed us to keep all the really shitty workmanship and call that a philosophical position rather than just running out of money. And then the next key move was accommodation. We really needed to shoehorn in as many bedrooms to house us all as possible. So the whole design came down to real planning efficiency. So it was a tight playoff between council's codes and the BCA stair requirements. So there's our very tight stair walking into the attic rooms. And then it's all about storage. I just can't emphasise how much it's about storage. Does anyone have kids in the audience, small kids? One person with small kids understands about the prams, and sometimes there are multiple prams, and there's a capsule, and there's a high chair that you need, and then you need to store that for a couple of months. And it's just like this unbelievable bulk of stuff that you need to ram into your house. So prams, bassinets, baby baths, car capsules and toys representing the kids. And then there's the adult storage for books, the cellar for my husband who's a booze hound, bless him, storage for suitcases which everybody has, pantry because he's a very keen cook, bikes. So we actually think about this house less as a series of rooms and more about the spaces that are left over once you ram in all your stuff into some cupboards. Beyond that, we were keen to open up to the very small sunny courtyard. Materials and finishes had to be incredibly robust because with no garden you have to let the hooligans scoot and skate around inside. So we've got a compressed fibre cement floor there and all the joinery is made out of plywood. And there's some more storage when we first moved in before it was rammed to heaving full of things. And there's one of the hooligans standing in front of the pantry and pram store. So finally we gave the 1970s rear of the house, there it is before, a bit of a tart-up and turnover. So we represent a really strong urban trend. We're young families who are opting for much smaller houses, and we're opting for public transport and bikes, and we're opting to walk, and we're opting to attempt to have a cultural life with kids, which is often thwarted. So as energy costs increase and the inner city makes more sense to more people who want less commuting, walkable communities and smaller houses that are cheaper to heat and cool, the downside is that the city is becoming more unaffordable. It's incredibly expensive to live in the city all of a sudden. So I wonder if the trend for smaller dwellings in denser, more walkable communities will move to the suburbs. So now I'm going to show some projects. Sorry, I'll give a brief introduction what's happening in the suburb and then show some recent work from the suburbs. So somehow in the last 50 years, Sydney has quintupled the average house size. So the average, so just to compare internationally, the average new build in Britain is 76 square metres, whereas in Sydney, biggest in Australia, it's 270 square metres. This is a 2010 statistic. It's come down a little bit, but it's still in the high 260s, which is, you know, just embarrassing. It's bigger than American houses. And since 2000, or between 2000 and 2010, the average price of a house in Sydney has doubled from $300,000 to $600,000. So we've got a real affordability crisis. And what does $600,000 buy you? A one-bedroom unrenovated terrace in Erskineville, or a massive house 30 kilometres from the city centre. In addition to houses swelling, house sites are decreasing. So we've got very big houses on very small blocks. And who's designing these large houses on small blocks? I don't know, but it's not architects. We're responsible for only 3% of new house designs in Australia. So with that context in mind, I'll whiz through some of the suburban houses we've been doing in the last 3 years. They hopefully address some of the issues of the environmental crisis in very small and modest ways. The complex relationship between publicness and privacy, and hopefully they demonstrate our joyful engagement as a team with our fabulous clients. If there's time, I'll show some speculative suburban projects after that address the concerns of the market and this triple crisis in suburban architecture. So to begin with Haus Schmuckler, which was drawn up expertly by a person in the audience. This is a small house sited on a small block. The block's just 7 metres wide in Roseland. The suburban context is really uneven and patchy. There's everything in the street from small bungalows to 5-storey apartment buildings, and stylistically it's a real mess. Our strategy was to create a rich internal experience in this house by suspending boxes within a kind of tube-like volume. The house presents a really restrained face to the street, which a friend of mine described as like a long, cool glass of water in the street, which I kind of love. The site's incredibly narrow, so our challenge was to bring light and air deep into the plan and to address the tunnel effect that an open plan of this proportion would necessarily have. I'll pause here for a moment to tell you a bit about our fabulous clients, Danny and Paul, who were completely hilarious and how magic of them to commission this house. At our first meeting, I presented 2 really polite, well-mannered schemes that were very safe, and also a little sketch about this scheme saying, you know what, I don't know if it'll work, but I've got this great idea about loads of voids and boxes floating in space, and I think it's going to be awesome. And they said, yes, we want that one. So it was, and the journey was like that the whole way along. They were really happy to engage in a kind of experimental and conceptual architecture. And even when this hit a 14-month pain in the ass in council, because the assessment officer couldn't understand why we wanted so many voids, and it made him mad, even then the client would say, is it true to the concept, Hannah? Don't compromise on the concept. So they were really quite amazing. Anyway, here are the boxes in the void that the client wanted. A few more boxes in the void, so that's the upper floor space, a small upper level living room and the rest are bedrooms. And then that's looking down to the dining room at night through one of the boxes. So this house has received some attention for its sustainability initiatives, and it's quite an unusual case study. So I'll run through that in a little bit of detail. It does all the obvious things like sustainable material choice, but it's also really economical in its use of materials. So where possible, we use the structure as the skin. So the internal lining is actually all the bracing of the house. It's not a decorative lining. And the structural floor slab is also the finish on the ground floor. It uses passive and adaptable solar control to the north. It's designed for cross ventilation, and air's pulled across the pool. It cools down as it goes across the water and cools down the house in summer. The double height spaces are designed to promote stack effect ventilation. So the high level skylights open up and allow the hot air to escape. And this was really important on this site because it's in that amphitheatre behind all the sandstone headlands at Rose Bay on the sand bit, so you don't get a lot of natural sea breezes. It's quite still. So by using heat differential to create ventilation, we were able to cool the house. In construction terms, we've got heavily insulated lightweight walls and internal thermal mass, which regulates thermal performance as well. And the boxes within the void strategy in section allows us to get natural light penetrating deep into the plan. So light from the north comes in through those skylights and it goes down 2 floors to the ground floor, and it creates a kind of warm, glowing light effect. The floor slab's hydronically heated. Most interestingly in environmental strategies, I think, on sustainability, is the spatial strategy. So this house gets absolutely walloped from the west by the sun. It really overheats. So on the western side of the plan, we located all the storage on the ground floor, so that acts as the, we use the storage and the laundry to be an insulating layer, keeping the living spaces cool. And on the upper floor, the circulation space is open to above and to the skylights, so the hot air can escape from the upper level, which keeps the bedrooms are all insulated, keeps them beautifully cool in summer. So it's not air conditioned, and it's delightful in summer and in winter. But finally, on the sustainability angle, I think the most important thing is to design houses that work really well and that people love, and then they don't knock them down every 7 years. I think as a society we really need to stop building rubbish and build things that we're keen to keep because we love them. The next house I'll show is called House Mar. This is in suburban Willoughby, and it's designed for a family with 1 child, and the mother's actually in a wheelchair. So this was the first project where we had to deal with somebody with very special spatial and physical needs. In architectural terms, it builds on many of the ideas in the previous house. It's a really the exterior is a very basic extrude, but it contains a playful volumetric interior. And we thought that since Emma spends so much time at home, creating a delightful and surprising interior would be a nice thing to do. So the front elevation is almost a diagram of a house. It's like the elevation that a child might draw, quite anthropomorphic with the 2 eyes and the mouth. But the interior hides these different spatial conditions or different cross sections as you move through the plan. So the living space has a big house-shaped space within a space that's double height and frames beautiful views of trees on surrounding sites. The study is the space between one house-shaped space and another house-shaped volume, so kind of wedged in. The 2 upstairs bedrooms are 2 little house-shaped spaces within a space, and then you have this kind of zone where there's spaces within spaces within spaces, and windows, internal windows between the spaces as well. So while the house in form and plan is essentially just a really overblown bungalow, the central corridor double loaded and a converted attic, in section it's something altogether different. So the brief was to create a house for a disabled person that didn't look like a disabled person's house. There are a few concessions or a few giveaways. The kitchen benchtop hydraulically lifts, which is pretty cool. And the bathrooms have soft floor, vinyl and grab rails. And the circulation's all really overscaled to allow wheelchair turning. And there's obviously a lift, not just the stairs. The pool's designed for hydrotherapy. You can see the ramp on the left-hand side of the screen. So as I said, the client's only moved in a couple of weeks ago and it's been an absolutely torturous build. But much to my joy, Emma said that being in her new house makes her feel like she's on a holiday. So that's been a really rewarding process for us. And finished at about the same time is House Chapel in Mossman. This is this is Kate tending the garden that her mother grew. She actually inherited this house from her parents. So it's quite an emotionally laden project for her. We had to take the house and make it feel like it belonged to Kate without completely eradicating all the memory embedded in it or associated with her family there. We're always keen to keep existing houses where we can. As you all know, it doesn't make any sense professionally because you don't build up your portfolio, you just wind up with a whole lot of cute little cottages in your portfolio. It doesn't make any sense economically because they're much more complex to do. It's much more complex and time consuming to do projects like this than to do a new build. And you know, it's not great for our ego, but it's the right thing to do. These houses perform really well thermally. The vernacular uses all sorts of tried and true techniques with thermal mass and shading and so on. And they also make really lovely streets. So there's a kind of detail in houses that I think the legacy of 90s minimalism has meant that these kind of dumpy matron aunt buildings, who 20 years ago we would have just said, oh, knock it down, it's a piece of rubbish, they've become more beautiful because we're building such horrible houses. And a lot of the workmanship's dying, or the trades are dying. So the strategy was to keep the cute bungalow exterior, but to hollow out the middle of the plan and create a continuous living space that ran from north with the view of the water to south with the view of the garden. And then the section was sculpted out along this central space to create some unexpected volumes over the living spaces and make them feel really new. Whereas in contrast, the cellular rooms, the bedrooms and bathrooms to the west and east are more traditional in their expression, and we've been a bit playful with that. So here's the central space looking from the front back to the garden, and that's looking from the deck on the garden side back in. And you can start to see that the roof folds in the middle up into those volumes that we found on the inside of the original hipped roof. And there it is again. We created a new stair connecting the house to the garage. And the clients wanted a lot of bookshelving because Keith, Kate's husband, has a collection of, he's an amateur Hitler and Nazism scholar. So, and she wanted the books to not be in the living space necessarily. She didn't want the fascist wing to be upstairs. So the books on the, there's something about, you know, a descent into the Hitler wing there, we said. We used some kind of nostalgic materials as a reminder of the old part of the house, but in a very new expression. Obviously, spatially, this house is a far cry now from what it was internally. And I think the views, there are views on the angle to the harbour, but also the views of these big old dumpy 1920s houses in Mossman are just gorgeous with all their shingle work and details and really crazy bay windows. There's a dining room again with that interesting volume. And then this is a sitting room in one of the cellular wings that celebrates the cut in the sandstone out the window, and we're going to grow a bright pink hanging orchid garden to look out this window. But you have to imagine that now because they've only just moved in. We kept the front door, but it was 2 double doors which were really mean in proportion, so we just stuck it together, which is, so you walk around the front of the house and it's all still old, the front door's old, and then you're in this unexpected new volume up under the peak of the roof. As I said, the bedrooms are much more traditional in their expression. We used really overscaled traditional mouldings, skirtings and very flat architraves, and then painted in 3 different colours up to a datum line in memory of what had been there before. The rear elevation, we extended the ridge out from the existing roof and then just cut it off with a really, really blunt expression, then folded the brickwork into window reveals. So that's how it was before, and then we go back to the finish. And there are a couple of little memories in this house of the crazy wall that Kate's dad built, which she wanted to get rid of, but isn't it glorious? This is another 1920s bungalow project, another dumpy maiden aunt of a house. This one had some nice original detailing on the front that had been quite compromised. But as you walk around the sides of the house, it's completely unadorned. So the only bit of modelling on the side of the house is the projecting eave, and otherwise it's totally flat. So our strategy was, in our rear yard addition, was to take that sense that the adornment diminished as you went around the building and to make the back of the house really, really flat, completely unadorned, and almost radically devoid of detail. Here are Mike and Sal, our awesome clients. They both work really hard in finance. They've got 2 kids. They had 1 kid when they started the project. He collects beautiful furniture, and both of them are interested in design. But the hilarious thing about these guys was the whole way along they'd say, "Oh, Hannah, we're not quite sure we're going to be cool enough for the house," which I thought was lovely. So we prettied up the front and restored the front rooms, which had some beautiful detailing, particularly in the ceilings, and some really eccentric mouldings. So there's Dougie's room, there's the main bedroom. And then we inserted a new corridor piece down into a very inefficient part of the plan that connected old and new, and that concealed a whole world of joinery to store a family's wealth of stuff, and also conceals a little study along the way. And then in the combined kitchen, dining, living room, you have one big volume. And the idea here is that the connection with the garden is achieved not by having a big opening of bifold doors, but by perforating a thin skin and having lots of windows into the garden. This strategy was partially about a response to the original house, partially an experiment in connecting to the garden in a way that's not just, a knee-jerk bank of bifolds, but very specifically it was about concealing views to and from the apartments that run along the back boundary. So we were able to frame really specific views. For instance, when you stand at the sink in spring doing the washing up, you can look at the jacaranda in bloom. There's a beautiful copse of trees, 2 sites to the northeast, and that little cluster of windows frames the view there. And so the rear is this really super flat, blunt, unadorned box. But the wonderful thing that's happened with this house is it's become that facade has become really interactive. So Dougie climbs in and out of the windows. Sally sits in one of the windows and feeds Ruthie in the high chair. And they have my little boy and Dougie had races with cars along the windowsill. And so the skin and that connection between the inside and the outside is actually a really thin zone, but it's really occupied. How are we going for time? Yeah? Everyone got enough energy for the speculative houses? Right, you may leave now and get some dinner, I won't be offended. Okay. So one of the things we like to do at Tribe is run little in-house competitions. So I set the brief to the team to create not a design, but some design briefs that would address some of those housing crises that I talked about before. So affordability, sustainability, entry-level housing, I think is a huge problem. How do you get into the housing market when the average housing price is $600,000? And density, how can we encourage density in the city? So the outcomes of the briefs then turned into design projects. So the first one was affordable house. This house is affordable because it's really bloody small. We've compressed absolutely everything to be, it's quite a mean house in that sense. The circulation's reduced to only 2.5 square metres plus a stair. But what is interesting about it in planning terms is that the car space, this is designed for the outer fringe, so it's not an inner city house that wouldn't need a car. This is designed for a market in which the car is critical, and 2 cars are critical even if you have a tiny house. So the car space could double as a playroom. So it's the ground floor on the left, obviously, with cars in it, and the bedrooms on the left, and the plan's upside down, so the living space is upstairs. So the car space can be a rumpus room, play space when it's not being used for a car. The entry doubles as a second car space should you need it. And the roof of the car space becomes formal outdoor eating space. So it's a very, very small house. It can be an attached series of houses like this or a detached house, all built out of lightweight construction, so the walls are also very thin and therefore small and therefore cheap. But we thought that a really interesting outer fringe suburban application for this house would be on the the north-south facing sites of greenfield blocks. So you could introduce density to those undesirable blocks with a strategy that always has light into its living spaces. So the upside down plan means that even though the orientation's crook, those houses would always have beautiful sunlight in their living spaces. The second speculative house is a garage top house. So this is a 2-bedroom plus study house that sits on top of the footprint of an average suburban garage. So this is a project that deals with a changing demographic. Maybe if your 30-year-old children are never going to bloody leave home, you build them one of these out the back. So it allows you to have a dual occupancy in an established suburban setting. But it could also be a new build, a laneway typology that creates great eyes on a lane, so great surveillance in what would otherwise just be a series of garages on a lane. So on the left, that's the sense that an existing suburb, that's actually Randwick, an existing suburb has the ability to take the extra density and new dual occupancy. And then the little master plan on the right shows how it might be applied in a greenfield development. So you'd have a lot of these on the south side where they were overshadowing the road, and you'd space them on the north side, further apart. The third speculative project is called Two Key House. So this house deals with the difficulty of first homeowners getting into the home market. So this is essentially a terrace house that's designed to have 3 separate iterations. So the one on the left, the ground floor is a workspace for maybe 5 people, and the first floor is a 1-bedroom apartment. The second iteration is 2 1-bedroom apartments, very generous 1-bedroom apartments, and the third iteration is a generous 2-bedroom house. So the idea is that you could buy a house and offset your mortgage repayments by renting out the ground floor. And when your circumstances changed, so you got hitched up with someone with a great income, or somebody died and left you lots of money, you could convert the house to a 2-bedroom house, and your outlay is only $2,000 in joinery changes. Again, this is designed as either an infill house, so it's designed on a 4.2 metre module, so you could build one in Paddington, or it could be a new greenfield development. This is the final project I'll show is a prefabricated house. So we were approached by some friends of friends who they had a house, a little bungalow in Freshwater, which they'd approached an architect to do some renovations on, and the renovation design to house their family had come in at a $750,000 build cost, which was not great. They had to spend a lot of money rectifying, all the brick ties had corroded and so on, but still $750,000 to wind up with a house that was still compromised by the original bones of quite a horrible little house, didn't stack up financially for them. So we said, hey, can we design your prefab house? So this house is built on a 2.4 by 6 metre, 2.02 by 6 metre module, which is a standard trucking module. It's got 3 to 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a study. So it meets a real suburban market need about accommodation. It's 170 square metres with 1 car in this iteration, but obviously it could have 2. And it's designed so that it can be sited on multiple different sites and still achieve great sunlight to the living spaces. And it's also designed to comply with complying development. So in theory, you wouldn't have to get a DA to build one of these houses. there are the elevations, the window arrangement slightly compromised by the CDC provisions, but it's still really cute. The interior finishes are all designed to be modular, so that the modular nature of it doesn't compromise the finish. So a 10mm gap between plywood sheets, so that when you bolt the modules together, it doesn't look like you've made a terrible mistake. And it's a good thing it wouldn't have to go through council, because I don't think any council would approve it. It's a bit too black and severe. So it's 170 square metres plus parking, and the off-the-shelf price of this house was $480,000, which wound up at about $620,000, including demolition and all the site works. So it became a really viable financial option for clients like our freshwater clients, and it also is a way of delivering affordable architecture and delivering it quickly. So it becomes more attractive to the general population if they know they're only out of their house for 2 months. And unfortunately it's on hold. The clients moved to Indonesia, which was very selfish of them. So in light of all of that, what do I think about the future of the city? Well, I think it's disappointing that we don't have revolving houses that follow the sun. But I seriously think that the way we're going to continue to build absolutely rubbish on the fringe that's environmentally greedy, poor quality, and it doesn't have any longevity. But hopefully increased energy prices and increased awareness about sustainability issues, and also an increased design literacy in the general population will mean that we build smarter, definitely, smaller, hopefully, and that these houses become more attractive to the general public. I think the city has to slow its outward growth, and it has to grow up where services already support it, and that's not a radical position, but we just need the general public to accept that. I think driving a car will become seriously expensive, and as it does, there'll be more and more pressure on the government to provide good public transport solutions. I also think in a social sense that people will be less keen to drive because it's just more time away from your social media. And if the public transport was good, who wouldn't be on public transport where you can do other things? No one likes sitting in a traffic jam. And finally, I think everyone will be hot. That's it.